presenter today is from Symantec. It's Colin Gibbens. He's the Principal Product Manager. I'm super excited that he's here. If you are familiar with any of the successes that Symantec has had at the Black Hat conventions with Symantec installed on an unpatched Windows machine, well, Colin is the guy who was instrumental in leading those efforts for Symantec. If you're not familiar with that, please drop me a line. I'd love to tell you all about it. But in a nutshell, it's what I just said. An unpatched Windows machine put on a network, hackers invited to break in, and unsuccessful. 2 years in a row. Send me a note and I'll tell you more about it. So today's presentation is about Symantec Critical System Protection, and in particular, locking down the vSphere architecture. Welcome once again. We're going to be covering Symantec's ability to protect vSphere. This is a single solution to harden virtual and, well, physical servers as well. And this is good for any regulated company where industry compliance is mandatory. So the question that I want to ask you, and what you should maybe be asking yourself, is what are you doing to protect the hypervisor? So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Colin. Colin's got an awful lot to tell us today, so go ahead, Colin, take it away.
Again, for everybody on the phone, my name is Colin Gibbens. I'm Principal Product Manager over at Symantec for the Critical System Protection product. Today, what I'm going to be going over with you is the CSP and how it can be used to lock down a virtual environment. More so, what are the policies that we've come out with for CSP to protect the virtual environment. So as customers are moving from more of a physical to a virtual environment, which a lot of customers that we talk to today, I would say a lot of them are 30 to 50% there, and I would say probably by the end of this year, I would say we're going to see more customers at 80 to 100% virtualized. Now, when customers are moving towards a to more of a virtualized environment, of course, all the same threats, all the same risks, all the same problems that exist in a physical environment also exist in a virtual environment. And that's one of the things that when we're out talking to virtual admins, the V experts, a lot of times these guys are not security guys. And that's the one thing that we've found. These guys, they don't know a lot about security. If you start talking to try to get down and deep with them security-wise, it just kind of goes over their head. It's just not what they live and breathe. And a lot of times what they do is they kind of, when you start talking about security, they kind of view security as more as a burden in the virtual environment than they do as a need. But with the compliance and compliance mandates, what we've been seeing is a lot of customers are realizing these virtual admins and V experts that if they have to meet PCI, if they have to meet SOX, if they have to meet HIPAA, FISMA, GLBA, whatever else is out there, that they have to implement the right types of solutions in their virtual environment to protect this architecture. Now, over the course of the past few years, we've seen quite a number of threats that are particularly targeted towards the virtual environment. One thing is specifically is Metasploit. If you go out there and you download Metasploit, there's actually new attacks within Metasploit that are geared specifically at exploiting different components of the vSphere environment, mostly geared towards exploiting the vCenter server as well as any systems running the vSphere client or any of the client tool systems. We've also seen cases over the course of the past year where we had the, I guess it's about a year ago, where the disgruntled employee, the disgruntled admin, the rogue client guy went up to McDonald's VP'd into his environment, loaded up a vSphere client on his notebook, and then logged into the vCenter server, and then basically started deleting guests. Ended up causing something like $1 million worth of damage to this organization. So one of the things that we can do with CSP is CSP, with our new vSphere policies, can be used to deploy at various different layers of the vSphere architecture to basically lock down the vCenter servers, the vSphere clients, as well as the data store. Now, when we talk about the hypervisor, in ESX, VMware ESX used to be built on top of Linux. It was used Red Hat Linux, and VMware used to allow organizations to install third-party drivers at the hypervisor layer. So for ESX, we had an agent and we had a prevention policy that could be installed there to lock down and protect the ESX server. When VMware moved to ESXi, they went to more of a bare metal approach. They went to more of a kind of a proprietary type operating system that interfaced directly with the hardware, that doesn't allow for companies like Symantec to develop applications that can be installed at the kernel level. So for ESXi, we currently do not have an agent or prevention policy that can be used to lock down the hypervisor. We do have a agent and policy that can sit off of the hypervisor and used to monitor what's happening at the ESXi level, which we'll get into and talk about a little bit more. So when we talk about vSphere, and we talk about where CSP can fit in the vSphere environment, we're talking about basically everything. We're talking about everything from the vCenter server to the systems that are running the vSphere client to even the guest that's running in the host, as well as any system that is running any of the vSphere client utilities. So a vSphere architecture can also include systems that are not directly related to VMware, but are interfacing with VMware, the vSphere architecture, for example, like DNS servers, Active Directory servers, other systems out there. And these systems are as equally important as locking down and protecting as the rest of your vSphere environment. Why is that? Because if I compromise one of these, if I compromise the DNS server, if I compromise the Active Directory server, if I compromise one of these systems, well then basically I have direct connection into your vSphere environment. And once I have direct connection into your vSphere environment, depending on what systems I decide to start attacking at that point, the vCenter server, which is basically the keys to the kingdom. If I can compromise that vCenter server and I can take control and manage that vCenter server, well, I can basically then cause havoc in your environment. Same thing as if I were to compromise a system running like Power CLI or the vSphere client, I could then again probably take control of one of those systems and cause some pretty bad havoc in the system in the vSphere architecture. That's the one thing that is different between a virtual environment and physical environment. Physical environments typically worry about one system, locking down that one system, where in the vSphere in architecture you have a lot of other components that, if affected, can overall affect the whole architecture. So CSP has different policies that can be used for monitoring and detection. So CSP, we have what we call the vSphere protection policy, which is a prevention policy, which can be used to lock down the vCenter server, the database server, the vSphere client box, any boxes that are running the CLI or any of the support tools. Prevention policy basically locks down the system, prevents the system from getting compromised, prevents any unauthorized applications from getting installed, and basically prevents any modifications or changes, basically change control on that system. We also have a vSphere application detection policy, which basically can be installed on any one of these components of the vSphere architecture, which can then be used to monitor what's happening on from a change control perspective as well. So prevention policy will prevent change. The detection policy will detect what activity is happening on that vCenter server or on one of these client tool systems. So yes, I might want to prevent the unauthorized unknown user from compromising the system, but I also want to be monitoring what that admin is doing on the system as well. What is he going out there and making changes? What is he installing on that system if he has the ability, the authorization to install something? So detection basically monitors what companies would call that trusted user. There's also the vSphere Windows baseline detection policy, which is detecting everything from an OS perspective. So this is looking at what new users are getting created, group membership changes, privilege changes, registry key changes, anything that's happening at the operating system layer of your vCenter server or your client systems. The Windows baseline detection policy is detecting all that. We also have what we call the vSphere ESXi Detection policy, which can be used to monitor activity and changes at the ESXi host layer. So this goes in, looks at what changes are taking place with your ESX configuration files, as well as your client host configuration files, and can alert on those. And we'll get more into details about all of this. We also have prevention and detection policies that can be deployed at the guest layer, whether or not it's a Windows box, whether or not it's a Linux box, Solaris, as well as we have detection policies, same type of detection policies that can be deployed at the host layer, the guest layer, to help customers meet PCI compliance, whether or not it's implementing file integrity monitoring or monitoring critical OS and application log files on the system. So a CSP, again, can be used to come in here and help an organization lock down and provide monitoring capabilities across various different components of this vSphere architecture. Now, VMware has what they refer to as the hardening guideline. The hardening guideline is basically best practices that vExperts and virtual admins should follow in locking down and securing their virtual environment. This slide, I will talk to a lot of times when I'm talking to the vExperts, because bottom line is all these VMware hardening guidelines that I've got listed up here on this slide are guidelines or requirements that CSP with our prevention or detection policies can help these vExperts meet these requirements in a lot easier and quicker way. Because a lot of times when I'm talking to these vExperts about these hardening guideline requirements, and I ask them, well, what are you doing to block access to ports not being used by the VMware vCenter? Oh, well, we're doing that with a network firewall. Well, you do understand that network firewalls have their flaws, and if they're misconfigured, well, basically, your VMware vCenter server is compromised. Or how to restrict network access to the VMware vCenter server system. Oh, well, we're doing that through our network firewall. Well, that's, bottom line is we all know so many customers have been compromised over the course of the past few years, and firewalls basically didn't stop them. So organizations, they need to understand that you need to get to the host level. You need to be locking down and implementing these types of solutions at the host layer, not solely depending on network-based IPSs and firewalls. So from a ESXi perspective, again, the hypervisor, we have what we refer to as a ESXi detection policy. This detection policy provides file integrity monitoring and log inspection for the ESXi host configuration files as well as the guest VMX files. It also is looking at the ESXi log files, the authorization log files, the shell log files, the kernel log files, looking for certain patterns in these log files that could indicate some sort of malicious or suspicious activity. This is really important when you're talking to your customers, especially customers that have to meet PCI. And the reason being is recently I've talked to a number of customers that have been deemed by their audit department or by an outside QSA for not providing the proper auditing on their ESXi host. Because if you've got an ESXi host and I've got guests running on that host and those guests have to fall under PCI compliance, that means everything that touches those guests also has to meet PCI compliance. And that includes the host. So part of PCI compliant, requirement 10, requirement 11 is all around log inspection and file integrity monitoring and monitoring what the users are doing on the system. So the host falls under that category as well. And you'll definitely see coming up in the next revs of PCI, more geared towards virtual environment, and that the host has to meet these requirements as well. We just got finished closing. Last quarter, we ended up closing about a $2 million deal with a large financial, and it was all geared around virtualization. And the reason being was the customer got dinged by one of their auditors for an outside audit firm for not having the adequate monitoring and detection capabilities around their ESXi host and the guest running on the host. For the ESXi detection policy to work, it requires a separate system to be set up, what we call the CSP Collector System. And this CSP Collector System, one of the prerequisites is that the customer has to install VMware CLI on this collector node, and then you install a CSP agent, and then we have this ESXi support utility that then uses VMware CLI to connect to the ESXi host to then synchronize the files off the host down to this collector node system, where then the detection policies provide file integrity monitoring and log inspection on these systems. I'm not going to go into great details on these slides. I will get these slides to Will to get them out to you. So basically, what the ESXi detection policy looks like is this is a screenshot of it. So basically, it is monitoring again the host, the ESX host configuration files, as well as the VMX. The VMX virtual machine configuration files. This can also help in the detection of spawning, or sprawling. So sprawling is, essentially somebody goes in there and sprawls up a new VM that maybe if somebody doesn't know about, and this happens quite often in customers. Where now, if I have an admin that goes in there and creates a new guest, new VMX configuration files get created, and CSP will detect that there are some new configuration files that got detected, and will basically send an alert and alert somebody that, hey, a new guest has been created, and you can see what the memory size is. You can see what the configurations changes are on that VMX file. As I mentioned before, the detection policies are also monitoring the root logins, shell logins at the hypervisor layer, as well as monitoring anything that is happening at the shell level. So if somebody, by default, shell should be disabled, but a lot of vExperts and VM admins want shell access on the hypervisor because they say that they need it for diagnostic purposes. Our CSP policy will monitor and detect everything that vExpert is doing at the shell level. So we talked about the file integrity component. Here's an example of some of the log files that we're looking at. We're looking at the authorization logs, which will give you all login failure, login attempts at the hypervisor layer, the shell log files, as well as the VMKernel log file. The VMKernel log file is one of the log files that is recommended in the hardening guidelines that is monitored. So the CSP policy will monitor these log files. One thing to take note about all this stuff is right now CSP, we're the only vendor out there that has this capability. Trend, McAfee, HITRUST, none of our competitors out there, including VMware themselves, don't have this sort of monitoring and detection capabilities at the hypervisor layer. Here's some examples, some other log files that you could set up CSP to monitor as well. We talked about this already, so I mean, again, I can look at log monitoring, the authorization log to basically look for failed login attempts, successful login attempts, look for people logging in at certain times of the day, monitor when the hypervisors, when the host is getting booted up. I can also monitor for maintenance mode, enter and exit, which is also something that comes up quite often in my conversations, where customers want to know they want to be able to detect if a vExpert is going into maintenance mode on the system. And the key thing is that with CSP, we're grabbing all these events, we're logging these events in the CSP database at the Managed CSP Manager, and guess what? The only person who has access to the CSP Manager is basically who's been authorized. So basically, your InfoSec, your IT operation guys. So essentially, the vExperts, the VM admins, might not have access to the CSP Manager, to the CSP console. So we're grabbing all these events, we're grabbing all this activity, moving it to CSP. So these VM admins, these vExperts cannot go in there and basically clean logs or clear their tracks if they're actually going in there and doing anything. You'll notice sometimes when you're looking at the CSP policies, like right here, we can see HMT15. Well, HMT15 is a reference point in the hardening guideline, which I just got finished showing you earlier, that basically states that VM admins and vExperts should need to be monitoring the kernel log file for any sort of activity that's occurring in this log file. So again, CSP, the detection policy is helping these VM admins, vExperts meet this hardening guideline requirement. Again, we talked about the shell use commands. You can sit there and record basically everything that is happening at the shell level at the hypervisor. And then also we're monitoring our own agent and our own logs at the collector node to look for particular problems. We set up log forwarding for certain log files that sit at the hypervisor. So the host D log file, the VPXA log file, we set up a syslog forwarding rule that will forward those log files to the CSP agent that's sitting on that collector node, and then forward that up to the CSP manager. So we're collecting all the activity that's occurring in these log files. Which again, if you notice, HLG01, which is basically a reference to the hardening guideline. So again, the key things to talk about with your customers when you're talking about CSP and these policies is how our policies can be used to help monitor activity at the hypervisor and help them basically meet the requirements of the VMware hardening guidelines. You can set up the detection policy, how often you want it to pull the ESXi server, how often you want it to look at to pull the files for the file integrity monitoring, see how often the host files are changing. The next thing that I'm going to get into talking about is the vCenter side. So we talked about the hypervisor, we talked about everything that we can do at the hypervisor, which again is all about detection, all about monitoring what's happening at the hypervisor. Now we're going to get into talking more about the vCenter, the client tool systems, and the host. So as I mentioned before, we have prevention policies and detection policies that can be installed at the vCenter level, the vSphere client systems, the client tool systems, the database server, or any of the other components that might sit in that whole vSphere environment, as well as detection policies to detect the activity. So what is prevention doing? So again, prevention locks down these systems. It prevents any sort of tampering of the vSphere binaries or the vSphere configuration files. It also locks down the SSL certificates that sit on the vCenter server to prevent an unauthorized user or an unauthorized application from going in there and gaining access to those SSL certificates. It also controls access between the vSphere server, the hypervisor, the database server, the client tool systems. So remember earlier when I talked about the hardening guideline, what was one of the requirements? Restrict access to the vCenter server. And most customers say, well, we do this with the network firewall. Well, that's not good enough, because if I compromise your environment, I can gain access to the system. So one of the things that our policies do is our policies will limit inbound and outbound activity from any of these vSphere components. So I can control who can connect to the vSphere, the vCenter server. I can control who can connect to the to my vCenter database. I can control what vSphere clients are allowed to connect. So again, going back to this whole situation where you had that rogue admin who was sitting at McDonald's and VP'd in, and then started deleting clients. Well, if they would have had control set up for their vCenter server, they would have been able to prevent any unauthorized connections to that vCenter server. Also, we're also basically preventing any malware infections. So we're CSP is takes a policy-based approach, not a signature-based approach. So we can basically stop zero-day attacks, we can stop APTs, we can stop malware from getting installed on the system. So let's kind of take a look at what the prevention policy looks like. So when you open up the prevention policy, you'll see what we call basically different lists that are created. You see like the vSphere database server list, the vSphere vCenter server network list. By default, the policy is pretty much ready to go. The only thing that needs to be added to the policy is that the customers need to come in here and put the appropriate IP addresses into these lists. Once they've come in here, that's all that needs to be populated in the vSphere this vSphere protection policy, is them coming in here and populating the network list with the right right IP addresses that reflect the ESXi server or the database server or the client tool systems. Other than that, the prevention policy is pretty much ready to go. By default, the prevention policy allows all network access to and from any of these systems. So again, they need to come in here, make changes, and add the appropriate IP addresses. Other than that, policy is ready to be deployed. Doesn't require any additional tuning. Here's an example of essentially the network communication to the vCenter server. As you can see from that VMware vCenter server, that system could be touching a lot of different components in the environment, whether or not it's the vSphere and the vSphere systems itself, or whether or not it is other components within the environment. So again, the CSP policies can help organizations control network access to and from any of these particular systems. And again, CSP and the prevention policies can be deployed not only on the VMware vCenter server, but it could be deployed on the database servers, the DNS servers, the Active Directory servers. I mean, most time we recommend CSP and prevention policies to be deployed on any critical system in the environment. Now, when we talk about detection, detection is a policy that monitors for change and activity on one of the vSphere systems. So this is monitoring, this is providing file integrity monitoring on the binaries, the vSphere vCenter binaries and configuration files, which again, if the customer has to fall under PCI, this is going to be a PCI requirement. That is, I mean, again, especially if they've got guests running on a host that have to fall under PCI, everything that touches those guests have to meet PCI compliance. So that means you have to have file integrity monitoring deployed at every point of the vSphere environment. You have to be performing log inspection, log monitoring at every point of that environment. So the detection policies are monitoring the vSphere binaries, monitoring the vSphere log files, monitoring the vSphere configuration files for any sort of changes. And when there is a change, it will log that change, and it will tell you who made the change, what made the change, and if it was a configuration file, it will tell you what got changed. Also, the detection policies monitor who is touching the SSL certificates. So again, the prevention policy will prevent somebody from gaining access to the SSL certificates, but let's say I'm a rogue admin and now I go and I try to grab those SSL certificates and move them someplace else. Well, the detection policy will monitor who's touching those SSL certificates. So if I was given the authority to have access to those SSL certificates, you also want to be monitoring who, what that user is doing with those SSL certificates. Also, in the VMware Hardening Guidelines VSH01 states that you should never run the vCenter server as the local system account. The reason being is the vCenter server is running as the local system account, and I compromise the vCenter server. Again, Metasploit, there's vSphere attack libraries that are already created that allow you to go and compromise a vCenter server. If I can compromise that vCenter server and it's running as local system account, well, then guess what? I have, I basically have control of the system. So VSH05 states you should not run it as system account. So one of the things that CSP does is it monitors the log files and it sees what user the vCenter server is running as. And if the customer has it deployed and running it as a system account, then basically CSP will detect that and will alert you that there's a policy violation, that somebody's running it as a system account, and that's a violation. CSP also provides general log monitoring of the VPX vCenter log files. So that's essentially what the detection policy, the detection policy is doing for the vCenter server, as well as the vSphere client or any of the client tool systems. Again, very important, especially when you're talking to customers about PCI. The vSphere Windows baseline detection policy, as I had mentioned earlier, it's not looking at anything that pertains to the vSphere the vSphere binaries or configuration files or log files. What it's monitoring is what's happening on the system that these components are installed on. So the vCenter server itself, it's monitoring what users are doing on the vCenter server. So who's logging into the vCenter server? What changes are they making on the vCenter server? Not necessarily what changes are being made as a VMware perspective, but other changes that are making. For example, adding additional users at the OS layer, maybe giving these user admin privileges, or maybe moving users to different groups, creating a guest account, an account lockout attempt, anything like that, anything that happens at the OS layer, the Windows baseline detection policy is monitoring. It's also monitoring who's logging into the box, what time of day are they logging in, are there failed login attempts. It's also monitoring critical registry keys, like the run once key in Windows and other key critical parts of the Windows registry key that are often attacked by malware, or looking for applications trying to make changes to critical operating system files. So the baseline detection policy is providing all the file integrity monitoring to help customers also meet PCI. So monitoring critical operating system files, monitoring critical application files on the system, and alerting of any changes to these files. Again, PCI requirement 11 basically dictates organizations need to be performing this type of function. We just got finished talking about the vSphere application detection policy, which is the application detection policy, which is monitoring the vSphere binaries, vSphere SSL certificates, and the log files in particular. So again, this is going through showing any sort of tampering to the vSphere binaries, looking at the log files, looking at who's touching the SSL certificates, again, letting somebody know that if the vCenter server is running as the system account, which it should not be, who's accessing the SSL certificates, what user, what time of day, what application access the SSL certificates, and if somebody is tampering with any of the binaries or application files. So we quickly went through, talked about the policies in CSP. The other thing that CSP provides is reporting capability. So all these prevention and detection policies that I've just gone over and talked about, essentially when you deploy these policies, prevention and detection policies in your environment, and if there are policy violations that occur, then those policy violations become events. Those events are then sent from the CSP agent to the manager, where they're stored in a database, and the CSP we have reporting capability that is used to provide reporting against the events that are generated by the policies. So when you install the CSP policies, we also have a reporting pack, and this reporting pack is used to report. We have out-of-the-box queries and reports, which are used to look at the events that are being stored in the database and report against these events. So we have queries that are used to look at different aspects of the events that are getting generated by these policy violations. And these queries are broken up based on the detection policies or the prevention policies, and whether or not it's detection policies and prevention policies that are protecting your ESXi host, or whether or not it's ones that are protecting your virtual machines. And so as the events are getting stored in the database, you can use these queries to query against them. So the queries are essentially matched out to the various different policies. And then these queries are then turned into reports. So within CSP, we have a reporting function that I can then use to basically take these queries, map them to our reports, and report against any of these sort of policy violations or behavior changes on the system. We give the ability that you can drill down on any of the queries. You can go in there and you can create your own queries to query against information. And then we also provide out of the box reporting. Now you can see right here where we have these queries that are mapped out to certain parts of the policy, where again you can see, for example, VMX55, VMX31, VMX22, which are basically requirements, pointers to certain requirements in the hardening guideline. More examples of queries that we provide out of the box. So we have 10, and then we have a couple reports that come with the product. I'm going to skip ahead. Yeah. So again, most of the like I present every year at VMware, and so and at VMworld and VMware, and I would say that most of the customers that I present to, the key things that are of interest to them when we talk about CSP, especially around the virtualization, is again meeting hardening, using CSP to help meet hardening guideline requirements, locking down the vCenter server, restricting network access to and from the vCenter server, protecting the various different components of their virtual environment. Low impact, and that's the other key thing. CSP is not, we're not signature based. Running on a system, we're very low impact. So the agent and the policy takes up about 20 megs of memory, and we take up about 100 megs of disk space. We use about 1 to 2% system utilization running on a critical system. And so we don't require constant updating. We don't require disk scanning. We don't require, and we can even help organizations around the whole concept of patch mitigation. Because the way CSP works and the way that CSP protects the system using prevention policies and the way that we wrap around the operating system and the applications is organizations that have legacy operating systems, legacy systems in their environment, that Windows NT, Windows 2000, that they're not getting patches for from Microsoft or any other system that they don't want to take down or to patch. CSP can be used to help organizations mitigate or at least lessen the time that they have to apply patches. Because again, bottom line is, with the way CSP works using policy-based prevention, is that when a compromise occurs against a system, a compromise occurs because of a vulnerability in an application that is then exploited by a malware or exploited by an individual using a toolkit like Metasploit or other applications out there. When they exploit a vulnerability in an application, that vulnerability then gives them access to the system, whether or not it's through a remote shell or whether or not allows them to make a change on the system or drop a malware on the system. CSP, it detects an exploit occurring against an application. What it does is it contains the outcome of that exploit. So if you've got vulnerable applications running in your environment, if you're running legacy operating systems that are vulnerable to attack, CSP wraps around these applications and the operating system, basically preventing those vulnerable applications from getting exploited. What it does is it basically governs good behavior. So it basically looks at everything running on the system with very little impact, and again, because it's policy-based, and so and basically the policies govern good behavior. So it's governing good behavior at the operating system level, the application layer, even with users. So one of the things that CSP does is it can de-escalate a user privilege. So for example, if I install the CSP agent and the vSphere prevention policy on my vCenter server, and I've got a rogue admin that goes in and tries to install a vulnerable application or any unauthorized application, CSP can de-escalate administrator and root users on systems down to a normal user. And CSP operates at the kernel level, so we're intercepting all system and I/O calls at the kernel level. So even if that person is administrator on the box, we're operating below Windows group policies, where all that level sits. So we're the first in line, first level of defense. So even if somebody, like I said, normally had administrative privileges, when you install CSP and you deploy a policy, those administrators on the box privileges are automatically are de-escalated down to normal user. I think that I mean, we still have some people on the line. I can actually even.
I think I think that's just about all the time we have.
Okay.
Boy, I can't thank you enough, Colin. This is such a information-filled hour, and I know there's way much more that you could talk about. To everyone who's attended, I thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly. My email address is right there on the screen, as is my direct number. That's my cell phone, so you can reach me day or night with that number. If you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to contact me. If you'd like to know more about that, the unhackability of CSP at the Black Hat conventions, let me know. I love to brag about it. I think it's a great story, and I love to tell you. So with that, we're going to lock it up here. It's just after 3. We've been going for a little over an hour. And again, thanks to everyone. And thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.